Hi, this is Squid, a new standalone hardware sequencer and controller from Toraiz, a pioneer DJ brand. In this clip, we'll go over Squid's basic features as well as the things that make it unique. I've counted 14 of those. And of course, the big question is, are they gimmicks or are they something that will improve your music making? Just to make sure we're on the same page, Squid is a sequencer. All the sounds you're hearing are from external devices Squid controls. More of this jam at the end of this video. Let's get started. I'll start with a general view of what's going on here, and then we'll dive in to take a look at what makes Squid special. An important factor when considering a hardware sequencer is the number of outputs it has, because that's not something you can fix in a firmware update. The more it has, the less you need to invest in MIDI splitters and a MIDI to CV converter. Squid has two 5-pin MIDI outputs. One can be used as through and one 5-pin MIDI in. MIDI over USB, and it can be USB powered as well, by the way, though all the onboard lights will dim when it's only USB powered. I can try and show that to you very briefly. This is how it is unplugged, and this is how it is plugged. It has two CV gate pairs, clock in and out, and DIN sync ports for your non-cloned vintage gear. It would have been nice to see a MIDI host jack as well, so you could connect and power USB MIDI keyboards. In terms of ease of use, I think that Squid is relatively easy to use in the sense that there aren't too many hidden shift functions and relatively no menu diving, but the main hurdle you need to get over is that these 16 pads have quite a few modes based on this column of buttons. Let's go over this very briefly. You can select tracks, one of 16 tracks here. You can either mute or solo tracks with track mute. You can choose different patterns in the track you're using the pattern button, and use pattern sets by hitting shift and pattern. We'll talk about pattern sets in a bit. The scale function will let you play notes or drums if this is a drum kit, and the shift scale will activate a chord function. In transpose modes, the pads are used to transpose your patterns. Triggers are for step sequencing, and shift trigger for CC sequencing. In time mode, the pads are used to set ties between notes and CV slides with shift, and you can activate and deactivate steps using the active button. The good news is that once you've wrapped your head around that, which does take a little bit, everything else is pretty straightforward. Let's talk about overall project scope. Each project that you store on Squid has 16 tracks. A track can be sent out to any one of the MIDI or CV outputs. So for example, track 2 is going out USB channel 1, and you can change that using this selector, and shift change will quickly go through the different output options. So you've got MIDI 1, MIDI output 1, MIDI output 2, USB, and then CV and gate. Once you've defined which output your track goes out, you can edit its patterns. Each track has up to 64 patterns in 4 pages of 16 patterns per page, and each pattern can be up to 64 steps. So this is one page in a pattern, and I can add additional pages to this pattern and scroll through them with these keys. Now, like I said, this hierarchy takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can always see on screen which track you're on, which pattern you're on, and if you're in the steps, which page step you're on, and if you're in the pattern, which pattern page you're on. Let's dive in one level more into the step level. Each step can hold up to 8 notes with pitch, gate, and velocity information per note, as well as count and divide functions. Divide lets you set ratchets between 2 to 4 ratchets per step, and count lets you wait between 2 and 4 additional steps per trigger. In addition, each step can store up to 5 MIDI CC values, and you can define which CC channels these send information on. Finally, aside for this per step information, the sequencer also stores groove bend, speed control, and rhythmic control information. More on that later. On a project scope, Squid supports the concept of pattern sets. Now, if you're familiar with Ableton Live, patterns are sort of like clips in a track on Ableton Live. They give you options to play a specific instrument in several different ways, and since you have 64 different patterns per track, you can store 64 different patterns for each of the instruments that Squid controls. Now, pattern sets works sort of like scenes in Ableton Live, or more actually like scenes in Machine by Native Instruments. You can select different sets of pattern for each scene and then swipe them all in and out as you like, either individually or as a group per pattern set or per scene in this analogy. A quick way to see which patterns each pattern set uses is just to hold the pattern set button. You can see here tracks in parentheses are muted and the numbers represents which pattern each track uses. So here, for example, track 15 uses pattern number 9, and then here track 11 uses pattern 2, and so on. Now, pattern sets are an extremely useful function. However, you do currently need to move from one pattern set to another manually. There's no arranger or pattern chaining functionality in the current version, 1.1, firmware of Squid. Now, while the 64 triggers per pattern is a hard limit, you can set patterns to play at different relative speeds and grooves, and can extend patterns using the count feature. So it's possible to a certain degree to create stretched out patterns that are longer than 4 bars, but that obviously isn't as holistic a solution as pattern chaining or an arranger. Let's talk about sequencing notes into a pattern. On Squid, this can be done either by playing them live or entering notes into steps. So for example, I've got this pattern. I could simply play into it. Right? Another way to enter notes is to step sequencing. These are the 3 steps that I entered. You can preview them, and then if I want to add another step, I can either just hit this and then change its pitch like this. Another cool way to enter notes is to find the note you want on the scale. Let's say this one, copy it, right? And then go into here and paste it, say, into here. Right? If you connect an external MIDI keyboard into Squid, you can both play notes live into it as well as hold a pad, press a chord or note on the keyboard, and that will be recorded into the pad. Recording by default isn't quantized, and you've got a resolution of 6 offset steps per note, and they can be different for the same steps. If you've got a chord, you can trill a chord in 1 step. Just for kicks, or should I say just for hi-hats, let's try out the ratchet feature. I've got this pattern going, maybe I'll just shorten it to get to the point quicker. Hit play. All right, so let's take this step and ratchet it, right? The count feature, by the way, delays the pattern. Let's just try that. Right? No, it'll get things out of balance, but lets you get to variable grooves if you like. To complete the basic feature set tour, and I'll go to track 3 again, back into scale. Scale mode really just lets you play the pads. The scale is determined here, so I can go anywhere from just a chromatic scale to any one of a number of scales. You can see that on screen here. That's just harmonic minor is fine. The only problem, or should I say feature request to the scale function, is that the semitones that aren't part of the scale are currently snapped to the note of the scale. It would have been better if the scale notes had been condensed to populate all the pads, so you'd get more than, I guess, basically an octave and a bit. You could actually get 2 full octaves and sometimes more depending on the scale on 16 pads. A really neat feature of the scale function is that it also applies to incoming notes you play on an external keyboard. So you can smash any keys you like on your MIDI keyboard and still sound reasonably artistic. Okay, so up until now we've been talking more or less standard sequencer stuff. Let's take a look at what makes Squid special. The first special and one of the most powerful features of Squid, in my opinion, is time warp. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm putting together a melodic thought rather than just step sequencing, I'll play around until I find something I like, then hit record and play that into the sequencer, and it takes a few takes to get that right. The problem with most sequencers is that if you don't get it right, you've got to go ahead and clear the pattern, record again. It's a little bit of a hassle. And that's where time warp comes in. It's always listening to everything you play, whether on the pads or on an external keyboard. And then when you feel like you've played it right, just hit time warp. And it turns out Squid has been recording everything you played in the last 16 bars. So let's try and work out a masterpiece melody. Let's say, well, that was good, but let's try something else, maybe. Okay, that's nice. So now I would have to hit record and recreate that lovely performance. But if I hit time warp, then these pads now represent events in history. Now they're not all full because I didn't play for 16 bars, but they would gradually fill up. So let's start listening. Right. Nothing went on here. This is the part that I liked. Then nothing happened here, nothing happened here. And this is the part I skipped, right? So this is what I want to store. And to do that, I just hit pattern and select the pattern slot that I want to store it in. Let's say in here, right? And now that's it. It's in there. So now if I hit play, go into patterns and press this, that's my lovely pattern. Now that was nice, but I didn't want it to repeat so quickly. I could go back in time again and find the spot where I played that, right? And now take maybe 2 bars, right? And this can go up to 4 bars. But let's just take 2, right? Go into pattern again, and let's say put that into pattern 8. Okay? So now if I hit play, this is my repeating pattern, and then this is my 2 or 4 bar pattern, whatever I copy pasted into here. So that was time warp. Another fairly unique and really nice feature for Squid is a dedicated arpeggiator per track. Now there's no hold function for it. Toraiz, please add that if you can. However, if you hit record and hold the notes that you want to be arpeggiated, that will be recorded into the pattern. So for example, I'll select an empty pattern and let's turn on the arpeggiator, go into scale mode. And I do want this to adhere with a scale. Let's go with harmonic minor, why not? Right. So this is my arpeggiator. It won't hold the pattern, but like I said before, I can just hit record and play this into the pattern. Right. Now, what just happened is I didn't actually record the arpeggiated notes, but rather the chord that I hit. So I can go ahead and while this is playing back, edit any of the arpeggiator values, for example, the rate. Right. Or style, let's do it down, go a few octaves. Right. Gate length and so on. Cool stuff. Another really nice feature in Squid is transpose and transpose locks. Let me explain. So let's hear this pattern, right? If I hit transpose, I can transpose this pattern anywhere from an octave up to an octave down. And there are a few semitone options here, right? The nice thing though is that you can record these transpose positions or lock them just by hitting record, and then they'll just play back. Now you can override these once it's playing back, right? So that's the current pattern, but you know, I could always choose to go up here if I want, and when I release it, it'll go back to the transpose pattern that I recorded. Let's move on. The next interesting feature is the note repeat pads option. So what happens here is these are, you know, our standard notes, but if I turn this little knob here, you've got note repeat top pads and note repeat bottom pads. And I'll turn off the arpeggiator, right? So these are my regular notes, but if I hold any one of these buttons, they'll repeat, right? Either in 32nd steps, 16ths, or 8ths. And then if I hold this, I'll get triplet versions of that. So another cool thing about this is that it makes the pads pressure sensitive. So if I go into, let's say, the drum track, so hold this, I can play different grooves this way. Now, unfortunately, unlike the transpose function, these repeats can't be recorded onto the pattern, so they're a performance-only function, at least in the current version of the firmware. Next up is the chord and harmonization features. Let's go back to the piano track, If I hit Shift Scale, I'll get to the chord functions. Now, these are pre-programmed chords in one of 18 different banks. So I can change the bank here, right? They've got all these fancy names. This one says Farewell. And like I said, quite a few banks here. You can't see what the chords are, so you sort of gotta go by feel here. Some of these are 5 and 6 note chords. That's way beyond my ability to identify what they are. You can, by the way, transpose the chords. Like this, and you can record these into the pattern. Now, aside from the chord function here, you also have the harmonizer function, which is another way to apply chords to pads. Let me just get out of the note repeat mode. And anyway, you hold one of the harmonizer pads, and you get a chord. Now, right now I'm in a scale, so we're not getting all the chord variations, just whatever is in the scale that I'm in. Now, unlike the chord banks, you can customize these. Just hold Shift and the pad you want to customize, and you can select any number of preset chord types and also program your own if you want. So you've got support for user chords as well. Okay, let's move on. Another feature that's really unique to Squid is interpolation. Interpolation lets you quickly automate the value of the pitch, gate, or velocity, or any one of the first 3 CCs between certain values, sort of like keyframes. Now, it's easiest to explain this with pitch, so I've selected a slightly less reverberant piano than before. I'll go into the trigger mode, and this pattern is currently empty, but if I fill it up, then I've got this, right? Simple, relatively boring pattern. Now, if I hit interpolation, I can select different spots within the pattern, and you can have up to 5 of these, but let's keep it simple and choose maybe 3. So I'll have this happen. Now here, I've got, let's say this note, and then let's go up to here, and then go down here, right? So I've got 1, 2, 3, and interpolation will, as you guessed, move between these, and I can apply a scale to that, right, and change it as I go along if I don't like it. Right? So a really nice way to quickly generate patterns. Like I mentioned before, same goes for gate, velocity, and CC values. Let's move on to randomization. Squid has quite comprehensive randomization features. So if I get back to my pattern, you can randomize pitch, right, or velocity, and whether steps will be active or not. Now, this is quite a nice generative technique. Now, this has 2 options in the menu. You can have it completely random or Euclidean, and yeah, it's just fun to mess with. And like I mentioned before, you can apply this randomization to gate, velocity, or CC. Now, I won't get into this now, but there are quite a few randomization options in the global settings. You can check that out in the manual, or pause this video real quick now to see what the options are. All right, let's move on to the next pretty unique feature, and that's this groove control section. Now, you're probably used to seeing swing, right? I think this groove is kind of groovy anyway, but swing is pretty standard stuff. This, however, lets you quickly accelerate your pattern or decelerate it, presumably, I guess, for keeping up with a record playing or something like that, because most electronic instruments have a way to sync. But it's also a nice effect, I guess. And if you want, you can actually automate this as well. So let's just mess with it a bit. Right? And then I'll hit play. And this automation on LED will show you when stuff is going on here if your patterns are getting funky. Another similarly funky and unique function is speed modulation. So the idea here is that you set a modulation shape, kind of like an LFO with synths, and a modulation length, And then when you apply this depth parameter, weird things will start to happen based on the shape and the length of the mod. So let's say if I try even steps, it'll be more apparent. Or let's apply this to the whole pattern again. So this can create anything from interesting grooves to the feeling of having a drunk drummer on board, but certainly a lot of interesting exploration options here. This applies, by the way, obviously to note patterns as well, not just to beats. Next is Squid's really unique implementation of running direction options. So to demonstrate this, I'm gonna interpolate myself a little pattern here. Let's just keep it simple. Okay, let's do this. Alright, so that's the pattern we're going to go with. Now, most sequencers will let you play a pattern forward, some will let you reverse it, or ping pong it back and forth. But then Squid has all these options. And switch back and reverse apply to them as well. Well, that's a pattern I'll never have to practice again. So, pretty nice stuff. Now, a more practical and less noisy use for this would be to populate your pattern with a few interesting notes and then play them in different directions and get inspired by whatever happens. Let's move on quickly to the rhythmic control section. This will let you create loops that are either 4, 2, or 1 step long, or with triplets. Different dotted and triplet variations thereof. And this you can hold, by the way. Right next to this cool little thing is the Trig probability option. What that will do is randomly either trigger or not trigger nodes in your patterns, and you can set the probability with a shift key. The higher the percentage, the greater the likelihood that a step will trigger, and vice versa. Now, unlike what you may be used to seeing in electron gear, trig probability applies to the entire pattern. If you want trig probability to apply to specific elements, let's say in a drum kit, you'll need to separate those elements into a different track and then apply trig probability to that track. Another, not exactly unique feature, because we've seen this in other instruments, but the way that it's done here is just to perfection, is the undo function. You've got 16 levels of undo. You can select any one of them that you want. And it undoes a pretty large variety of actions on this. So if you make a mistake, it's quite easy to go back. Another feature that's pretty rare on sequencers and is extremely well implemented here is MIDI import. You can download either PC or Mac software that lets you export and import projects, as well as transfer patterns and MIDI files and bring MIDI files onto Squid. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I made a tutorial about how to get MIDI clips onto almost any sequencer, but this is way simpler and supports a really seamless workflow. For example, all these lovely groovy patterns. I didn't program them in, right? They're all drag and drop from Easy Drummer onto Squid. It's really quite easy. You just go into the pattern tab. You can see that as I change the pattern here, it'll also change in the software, right? So it's always looking at the current active slot, and then I can either drag this out or drag a pattern in real time, by the way, and it'll just start playing it. By the way, for some reason, Squid's manager software didn't accept the MIDI files Easy Drummer generated directly, but once I dragged the files into Ableton Live and then saved them, everything worked fine. So I guess there was some MIDI data there that Squid didn't like. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. On the pros side, I have to say Squid has quite a few original features. I mean, we've seen mutes, solos, chords, CC modulation, ties and slides before, and even Ableton Live style clips and scenes. But features like time warp, which I've only seen with Ableton Live's capture feature, 16 arpeggiators, MIDI export and import over USB, speed modulation, and so many running directions, groove bending, and rhythmic speed controls. All those are quite rare and non-existent on other sequencers, so kudos to Toraiz for originality and frankly courage, and I don't mean that in the Apple way. Finally, on the pros side, I think Squid is actually quite easy to use once you get over the hurdle that the pads have quite a few different modes. On the cons side, however, there are a few things worth mentioning. The good news is that hopefully these can be changed in firmware updates. The biggest thing I'd add is either pattern chaining or a full-blown arranger/sequencer song mode. 64 steps is just too few for a major sequencer contender, which Squid definitely is. Now, while rhythmic control and variable speeds for patterns and the count feature are a few ways around this 64-step limit, without pattern chaining, you should consider this if 64 steps is too limiting for your workflow. I already spoke about the scale function. It would be great if the pads that aren't active in a scale would be taken out and replaced with notes that you can play to extend the octave range. Another thing I'd like to see is MIDI learn and CC naming for the CC automation controls. Nothing will slow you down more than opening your Gears manual and digging through a CC lookup chart, and if you come back to Squid after a while, you're probably not going to remember which CC knob does what on which piece of gear. You can name tracks, which is a great start, but I'd like to see CC parameter naming as well, because I guarantee you won't remember what CC 103 does a day after you program it. Ideally, they'd come up with cross-project device profile capabilities, so once I've set up, say, how to control Siren over here, I could take that immediately to other projects and not have to reprogram it every time. Finally, it's a little bit hard to make drum patterns on just one track. Now, I drag and drop this from Easy Drummer, right? So making this took me exactly 10 seconds. But if you want to create a pattern from scratch on one track, you've got to program notes to correlate with the kick, the hi-hat, the snare, and so on. And you've got to program that as polyphonic chords, which is quite a hassle. Now you can separate the kick, hi-hat, snare, and so on to different tracks, but then you'd be using up a lot of tracks in your project. So ideally they'd come up with a workflow to make this a little bit simpler. A few minor requests while we're here. I'd like to see a control all function like in the Electron devices, so you can affect parameters across multiple tracks and certainly across different pages in a pattern. Finally, for some reason it's a little bit hard to read what these pads say when they're off. They're designed a little bit differently from here, so if you could just bring up the LEDs here, even when these aren't active, you could see these certainly in the dark. Now, despite those cons, Squid is a serious sequencer full of pleasant sequencing surprises. Toraiz have innovated on quite a few fronts here, with my favorite being time warp and multiple arpeggiators, and set the bar quite a bit higher for other sequencers. Toraiz came out with a very strong feature set here, and one would hope they'd continue to support the platform with future updates. If you're wondering how this compares to other sequencers and samplers, there's a full sequencer and sampler buyer's guide in my book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comment section below, hit like if this was useful, and if you ring the bell after hitting subscribe, there's a good chance you'll see the next one. Thanks for watching.